I'm going to give you a little peek behind the curtain that I probably should not do, um, but I'm going to do it anyway and tell you that there are pastors out there in this world who write their sermons on Sunday mornings. Like Matt Fleming gets up at 5 a.m. and goes into the office and writes his. Meta usually is just like writing it in her car on the way over in her head, like not really writing it. I am not like that. And the only exceptions to that were like some of the sermons that some of you remember from the summer of 2020 when I wasn't sleeping at all and writing sermons in the middle of the night to the sound of helicopters. And this week is no different. I wrote that sermon on Thursday sometime, and I felt pretty good about it. It's a very long sermon. And I knew it needed some editing, and I was going to do that on Friday, but I didn't. And then I was going to do that on Saturday, but I didn't. So I set my alarm for like 15 minutes earlier this morning so I could get up and clean it up a little bit. And it was gone. And things just don't disappear on Macs. And so I spent 45 minutes looking for it because it's got to be there because it's a Mac. But it was not there. So wherever it is, it's not there anymore. I was going to tell you about a conversation that's playing out in the Star Tribune over the last few weeks because of a letter that over 900 faith leaders in Minnesota have signed. That included me, and it included every pastor at Bethlehem Lutheran Church of Twin Cities. It was to call for a special legislative session to get Minnesota to talk about a ban on assault-style weapons in the wake of the Annunciation shootings. That letter was delivered by 70 faith leaders to Governor Walz not last Wednesday, but the Wednesday before, and it began that 7 days of prayer that we talked about last week. Every day at 12 o'clock, there was a prayer service that was led by one of those faith leaders, and I know some of you went and participated in that, which I'm thankful for. I got asked in the pool yesterday if I was going to be going anywhere yesterday, and I was like, I know I have seen people out in the streets in wheelchairs, and so if this were a permanent state for me, I would figure out a way to get out. But right now, I feel like I can't walk very far or stand for very long, so I'm pretty careful in the things that I choose to do. In any case, I was going to tell you about the pastor who chose to write a letter to the Star Tribune about why he didn't sign that letter, which had to do with his congregation containing lots of people across the spectrum on every issue. And as a large, big tent church, he wanted people to be able to go to church and not have those parishioners worried about what their pastors thought about who they voted for. And another letter that went out in response to that from some of the people who did choose to write the letter in response to that. And I'm going to read that letter to you. That letter says, this was mostly crafted by Ingrid Rasmussen, who's, my hero in the pastor world, one of them. She is over at Holy Trinity and works with, we've heard from David before, and he probably had a part in writing this too. And then there were a number of people whose hands were in it before it got published. In the strip, and it says, last Wednesday, 70 of us gathered in person at the Capitol to deliver a letter that has now been signed by over 900 faith leaders, pastors, deacons, rabbis, imams, chaplains, and clergy elders. This letter, addressed to Governor Tim Walz and members of the Minnesota legislature, call for a special legislative session to enact a ban on assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. Written in response to the recent school shootings, it asks our elected leaders to act, to turn our collective heartbreak into laws that protect our children and communities, and to lead with courage our public life, our public life so desperately needs. I need to say that the person who wrote against the letter was clear in saying it doesn't mean he doesn't support legislation about that, but because he leads this large church, he felt like he shouldn't sign, and also because he didn't know if writing a letter like that or calling for a special legislative session would do any good. He said what he'd rather see is courageous conversation. And Then he admitted he's not sure that will do any good either. So, and I'm not either, and that's part of what we're going to talk about today. This list of the letter goes on. The list of 900 faith leaders continues to grow, and each leader is deeply engaged in communities across 69 counties, from Hermantown to Bemidji, to Brainerd, to St. Cloud, to Avon, to Annandale, to Afton, to Blooming Prairie, to Austin, to Albert Lee, to Blue Earth, to Montevideo, Barnesville, woot woot, that's up by Moorhead, to Bryceland, and to Alexandria. This letter is not signed because of partisan politics or social optics, but out of our shared grief and moral urgency. We believe there is a new story unfolding, a prophetic pastoral witness emerging from our communities. It calls all of us, including those in power, into deeper solidarity with one another and all who suffer. Over the past 7 days, faith leaders and teachers and community members have gathered at the Capitol for prayer and action. We came because elementary students, oh boy, should not have to tend to bullet wounds. Because teenagers should not need to carry first aid kits in their backpacks. Because teachers should not have to calculate sight lines. Because this is not the part I thought was going to get me today, by the way. I haven't come up with what my joke is yet. This is what you're supposed to do when you start to cry when you're speaking, is tell a joke and then you get over it. But I guess I'm making all of you cry too, so it's okay. Sightlines in their classrooms. Because parents should not have to run barefoot into the street to see if their children are alive. And because doctors should not have to bear witness to the exponential violence assault weapons and high-capacity magazines inflict on little bodies. And because clergy should not have to bury the youngest among us and hold the anguish for those who love them most. Okay, let's take a breather. This is bigger than partisan politics. It is a call to mutual accountability for the sake of our children and the well-being of our communities. It is a prophetic collective cry born of pastoral concern. Our communities are in pain, and our leaders must respond with courage and integrity and urgency. When we met with the government officials, we told them, goodness, I slept last night even, that as leaders of diverse communities with as many opinions as people, we know how difficult it is to decide and to act. But we also told them we are here to support you in brave action. We too hope to create and realize the world we long to live in. As we ground this work in Scripture, we are drawn to the story of the persistent widow, which we just read because it's the one assigned for today. It was assigned that way decades ago. She refused to be silenced. She insisted on being heard. She demands justice, not out of rancor, but out of necessity. That is the posture from which we come. This is not a demand of malice, but an insistence born of conviction, shaped by anguish and sustained by hope. Like her, we keep showing up because lives are at stake. Like her, we do not lose heart. We have weighed the cost and are willing to risk the potential opposition for the sake of greater good. At the Capitol, we heard clergy speak about the toll this crisis has taken on their own families and congregations, their children navigating lockdown drills, their spouses working in public schools, the funerals that they have had to lead for children and adults who died by gun violence. This movement is deeply rooted in relationships and proximity to pain. There is nothing performative about it. Our vocation as faith leaders is not to center ourselves or preserve comfort. It is to love our neighbors and amplify the voices of those who are suffering. We stand close enough to the pain in the world that we cannot look away. Faith compels us to do more than pray, but to act according to ensure that those who are most affected by violence and grief and injustice are heard, and to insist that our shared life be shaped by courage and compassion and care. We remain steadfast in faith and hope, believing that another way is not only possible, It is necessary, and the time is now. As I said, the person who didn't sign this letter, well, there were lots who didn't sign it, only one chose to write about it in a public place, said he didn't know what good it'll do. And it's true. No one went into special session because of it. And here we are with nothing changed about guns in Minnesota. He suggested instead that we have these very brave conversations, and no one can dispute that. That's necessary. And that also can start with a letter delivered to a governor. He's not sure that having brave conversations will work either, and neither am I. No one knows what works, right? But I'm pretty sure that throughout the course of history, there isn't any one thing that worked to change who we are and how we relate to each other, or change the course of history. It has always required lots of people doing lots of different things among lots of different channels. There are always fights about the best way to approach things and what our job is, and yet it is the combination of all of those different things that create the groundswell that finally moves the needle on anything, and that's persistence on a lot of different fronts. So let's talk about this persistent widow for a second. Whew. That's a little bit easier. Can you go back, Joel, a couple slides so that we can look at this? Does anyone have questions about this? About the need to pray and not lose heart. He said, in a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people. Sorry, what? True. Here's a tricky thing, and the reason why we sang some songs about God and who God is and what God is like at the beginning of this service. When we hear parables that Jesus tells, it's really regular for us to choose to graft God onto the character in the story that is the most powerful. And so in this story, that would mean that there, maybe you, maybe me, people all over the world, read this and think, all right, so we're like the persistent widow, and then there's the judge, and that must be God. But if you look closely at this, we're looking at, in a certain city, there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people. If that sounds like the God you know, I would like to introduce you to a different one. Because that does not sound like the God that I believe that I know. Great. I'm glad that you had that figured out. I am telling you that there are people all over the world who will put God in that place. And I'm telling you that that's not where God is in this story. But I'm glad you don't need to know that. Okay. So moving on, if that's not where God is in this story, then where is God? There's a couple different options. The one is to say, if this is how, so the persistent widow just keeps going back and wears this guy down, and it works because he doesn't want to be bothered by her anymore, and so she gets what she wants, and then the story is like, how much more then will God answer you? So it's a way of saying, like, if this even works for the one who is unjust, and God who is just is going to respond more quickly than that. But you could also take the move and say, what if God is the persistent widow? What if God is the one who is relentlessly pursuing us and relentlessly pursuing justice, and also teaching us to do those same things too, to all of the unjust rulers that are in this world? There are some different jobs that the different parts of God can take on. That's true. So when you read those parables, you have to ask yourself if God is not the unjust judge or a nasty king that makes him the character that we always think we are. Also, what if we are the unjust judge whose heart is slow to turn, but who God keeps on pursuing? Any way you look at it, the task for us at the end is the same. We are given this example of the persistent widow to keep asking, keep doing the thing that you're doing to fight for justice in this world. Some of you did that yesterday, I know. There are those among you who would say that I and this church are not political enough. There's so much to do. It could be every person's full-time job to fight injustice on every front, so we do what we can. And there are those of you who would say that you just want to come to church and be comforted and not deal with the politics of the day. And some days we do that. If I did that today, if you want to hear that sermon, that would sound like this. And so pray. The persistent widow prayed, and you should also pray without ceasing. I'm not sure what you'd be praying for, because she's praying for justice. So you figure out what that looks like without your pastor naming it. But the politics of the day are making other people uncomfortable while we would sit in comfort in their whole lives. So it must also be our business to amplify the voices of the suffering, even at the expense of our own comfort. And so this woman, this persistent widow before the unjust judge, she is our ancestor. And whatever injustice you're fighting for, remember her as you do your part. There's this musical that that has a song in it that I've been thinking about all week long as I both reflected on this sermon and then wrote it twice. And it's the musical is called Suffs, not sus, Suffs, as in short for suffragettes. It's important for you to know because it's coming here in March and you should buy tickets. And it has a song, if you were out yesterday, you should listen to it on the way home, called Keep Marching On. And it tells a story about the suffragettes who had their own interior fights about the right ways and the right methods and tactics to use and what works and what doesn't. And it has a song I'd love to read you all of the lyrics of, but I can't even think of the song without crying, and we already know that I'm halfway there, so I'm going to see if I can get through like 4 lines of it to end this sermon, so that it doesn't get too awkward while I just weep up here. So this is what I decided on. Your ancestors are all the proof that you need, that progress is possible, not guaranteed, and it will only be made if you keep marching on. Well, the sermon was something like that.